Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian angle on what's going on in the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host for the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and former Ludwig von Mises professor of economics at Hillsdale College. Richard, good to see you again.
Great to be here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yep, if you're listening in for the first time or you're watching for the first time, come to see us at fff.org, where you get the principled case for liberty presented and libertarianism for the past 28 years that we've been publishing and having conferences and seminars, including Richard's article that he writes for us once a month and sometimes even more often than that. Richard, let's talk about democracy. I mean, we hear that term bandied around a lot. We know that there's an presidential election coming up in 2020. It'll be sold as, one of the virtuous things about the Western world is that unlike the totalitarian or communist states, we have elections. We have a democratic system. We've heard presidents who go to war for democracy, make the world safe for democracy. It's like this grand and glorious thing that is sold to the American people in the world. One of the highlights they tell us about the democratic system is that it produces really high quality candidates for political office like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and that this is one of the virtues about the stop smiling, Richard, about the democratic system. So let's talk about this, because this is a word that's not even in the Constitution. I mean, you would think that if democracy is so important, then why not put it in the Constitution? Well, there's a simple reason for that, and that is that unlike today's politicians and bureaucrats, our founding fathers and the framers understood that democracy was an extremely dangerous kind of system, and that is dangerous to our liberty. There's that old saying about democracy is the very worst system except for all the others. And Ludwig von Mises pointed out that the only real advantage of a democratic system is it enables people to shift gears philosophically or political wise by changing the people in office peacefully, so that if people want to move, let's say, from a free market system like the United States once had to a socialist system, there doesn't have to be a violent revolution. You just simply elect Franklin Roosevelt president, and you continue to elect any number of Democrats and Republicans after that who favor the welfare state way of life. It's all done peacefully. And this is what Mises was talking about, that democracy simply provides this peaceful means of transition. But it is certainly not equivalent to freedom, because you can have a democratic system that is very totalitarian. For example, suppose you have a Hitler, for example, who's democratically elected. Well, he has totalitarian powers. He has oppressive powers. He's a democratically elected tyrant. And so this is what our ancestors understood, that democracy does not guarantee freedom. In fact, it can be a tremendous threat to freedom, and that threat and that concern for that threat is reflected in the Bill of Rights, for example, the First Amendment, that protects people from having their certain fundamental rights like freedom of speech taken away from them by majority vote or through democratic vote. So, in essence, democracy is simply a means by which people are peacefully transitioning from one person or one philosophy or one political party to another. Doesn't guarantee freedom, and in fact we have to protect ourselves against the majority in a democratic system, because it can pose a tremendous threat to our liberty and our well-being. What do you think?
Well, let me sort of elaborate or complement some of your observations. Let us recall that through most of human history, governments have not been democratic. not in any way representative of the expressions of the population. There have been absolute monarchs, there have been military tyrants, there have been civilian dictators, just cruel, power-imposing rulers and conquerors, such as the lords of the manor, when the Roman Empire was defeated by the Germanic tribes and their lands were occupied. What would happen is you'd have some of the tribe leaders then divide up the conquered lands among his lieutenants, and those became the, let's say, the French aristocracy. They and their descendants became the lords of the manor with the ownership of the plundered and conquered land, as well as all on it, including the people who owed obedience and service to them. Now, there had been ideas of democracy, that is, the people ruling themselves as opposed to others ruling them, since the ancient Greeks. Aristotle speaks of different types of forms of political order, of which democracy is one. But through most of history, even those who wish to replace the rule of the one or the few over the many with some form of democracy, they also, if they valued liberty, as you were suggesting, if they valued liberty as well, they invariably often spoke of the need to restrain democratic rule, even by the people themselves, through constitutional restraints, either written or, as in the British tradition, mostly unwritten. But the idea that there are certain things that belong to the self-governing individual, that the self-governing political majority may not violate, abridge, or abolish. So in the English tradition, out of which obviously the American tradition arises on these issues, the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of right of petition of regress to the government. All of these things are considered to be sacred and sound, or trial by jury, as opposed to just a mob deciding whether a person is guilty or innocent of something and undertaking their vigilante revenge. All of these things were considered areas of rights of an individual that even a majority could not step on. So when our Bill of Rights in the First Amendment says Congress may pass no law, what it's basically saying is that even if, in principle, 99.9% of the people in the United States did not like something that Jacob Hornberg was saying or writing or doing in the peaceful and voluntary affairs of his own life, that 99.9% of the U.S. population could not abridge his freedom of speech, his freedom of association, his freedom of press, his freedom of religion, no matter how disagreeable or even repugnant they found Jacob Hornberger to be. And having known you for many years, I can appreciate, some people perhaps having those years. But we won't get into that for the viewers and the listeners. But the idea is that what it was is that democracy was a means, an institutional means, as you were saying, referring to Mises, of a transfer of political authority by the peaceful means of the ballot box rather than the bayonet or the bullet. But what the government would do after this peaceful transfer, the democratic mechanism of electing those who would hold office for some specified period of time and then be up for re-election or removal, that was left unanswered. Democracy is a mechanism. It's sort of like a road. The road enables people to use it for many different purposes, but the road per se does not say where people should be going, why they're doing it, and when they should be going out there on the road. It's merely a means of assuring that the rule of the one or the few will not oppress the many. That's why democracy needs to be tempered and complemented by a political philosophy such as the classical liberalism of a John Locke or the founding fathers or others who came after them, that says, in spite of what majorities want, each individual has certain rights which are inviolable and may not be abridged. That we begin with the self-governing individual, and he and other self-governing individuals agree to combine to form a government for purposes of protection of their rights, their liberties, their properties, their lives. But the government is not in any way to abridge or violate the originating self-governing rights that each person possesses by nature, as John Locke would say, with natural rights. Now, the problem is that tradition of combining the notion of democratic government with, at the same time in the late 18th and through at least the first half of the 19th century, the belief in a general philosophy of classical liberalism, the term democracy became a covering term for both representative government, that is, electing those who will hold political office peacefully, and at the same time the preservation of these liberties. For example, in the 1930s, with the rise of totalitarianism, the communist form, the Italian fascist form, Hitler's Nazi form, there appeared books such as Democracy and Despotism, or The Crisis of Democracy. And if you read the books like that from the 1930s, many, though not all, written by friends of individual freedom and often free enterprise, when they spoke of the choice of democracy versus despotism, or a crisis of democracy, they were rolling up into one, that covering term of a government selected by the people through election, and a government that respected the rights of the individual, even in a democracy, in the way that you were mentioning and that I've just said. But today, we have a situation where, since the political attitudes and philosophies have changed, that we're not as concerned with individual liberty as redistribution, regulation on the basis of some wider notion of a common good, a general welfare, a social justice, all of which are often empty and hollow terms that can be filled with anything that the proponent wishes to put into it. Democracy now has become an end in itself, as long as the people have expressed their will, either in an election of someone, or like happens in California, in a referendum, for instance. As long as the people have expressed their will, then that will should not only be respected, but enforced, and that everyone in the society should view themselves as subservient, obedient, constrained by and conforming to whatever the majority wants. So now, if the majority wishes to elect people, such as a Bernie Sanders, or as are other democratic socialists who have joined Bernie Sanders in the Congress recently, if democratic socialists were to be elected in sufficient numbers to have majorities in the House, the Senate, to the presidency, then the presumption is that the people's will has expressed that the government extend its net of control over many areas that, in the traditional notion of liberty, would be considered violation of people's freedoms: their freedom of movement, their freedom of occupation, their freedom of association and exchange, their free use peacefully and non-fraudulently of their own private property for their own purposes, and the production and exchange interactions with others. All of that could be now abridged because the will of the people has been expressed. In this instance, democracy has degenerated into mobocracy. That is, whatever the mob wants must be established. Now, unfortunately, this is a strain that has been present not just in general, but even in America for a long time. If one reads the accounts that Europeans wrote in visiting the United States in, let's say, the first half of the 19th century, and some of them are fascinating reads, they all, let's say during the 1820s or the 1830s, they're fearful of democracy in America because they think there's a mobocracy already at work. So even at a time in America where those notions of our personal freedoms and civil liberties were generally considered inviolable by most people, already there was a concern that there's this mob mentality, that whatever they want, it gets expressed in the political situation. Now, At that time, and for a long time after that, there was the respect for and the appreciation of the constitutional restraints securing the liberty of the individual. But we've reached a point today where that does not exist, where democracy equals freedom, whereas democracy is a mechanism that may or may not preserve freedom, but whether the democracy prefers freedom or not depends upon the political philosophy of the citizens as to what they think the legitimate and limited roles of government should and could be. So before democracy can become a full companion again of freedom, a philosophy of freedom has to be restored among our own people so that they wish to use democracy for its legitimate and narrow purposes and not as a tool to oppress the freedoms of their neighbors.
Yeah, I think your point of going back historically on the nature of government and how people viewed their relationship to government is very important, because throughout history, when people lived under monarchs, the idea was that the monarch was in total control of your life. I mean, that was just a given, that he was a subject of the crown. And especially if we go back in our history, English history, from which the common law came, that was the attitude, that I'm the king. If I want to take your life from you, I have that authority. If I want to take your property from you, if I want to tax you to whatever extent to fund my foreign wars and the expenses of the state, I can do it. And nobody questioned it. I mean, this was just the norm until all of a sudden in 1215 Magna Carta occurs. And here the barons of England, essentially at the point of a sword, extract from the king, King John, an admission that his powers are limited. I mean, that's the real significance of Magna Carta. Nobody had ever done that before, where they forced a king to say, okay, I concede, my powers over the citizenry are limited. They're not omnipotent. And among those was that the king could no longer just kill somebody without what was called in violation of the law of the land. And that phrase ultimately evolved into due process of law, a phrase that found its way into the Fifth Amendment and later into the 14th Amendment. And same thing, you couldn't take away people's property without due process of law. Well, this was an enormous limitation here. Now, there still had to be definitions that would evolve of what these terms meant, but gradually they meant notice and hearing over the centuries. And so you have these times in history where people are saying, we have rights that you cannot infringe upon no matter if you're the king or what. So that idea then came into existence when the Constitution was proposed. Now remember, the states had been operating since the Declaration of Independence as the Articles of Confederation. That is, they were independent sovereign states that had confederated together, come together in a confederation, which had a federal government, but its powers were so weak that it didn't even have the power to tax, because people didn't want that government to have large powers. They feared that kind of government. Then the Constitution comes into the Constitutional Convention proposes something brand new. Instead of modifying the Articles, which that's what their purpose was, they're now proposing a new federal governmental structure. And people were very leery, saying, okay, yeah, it's a democratic system, but it could be a system that's going to take away our freedom. And what happens if the government then, assumes the power to kill us without due process of law, or take our property without due process of law? And the proponents of the Constitution said, no, that can't happen, because the Charter itself is going to set forth the powers of the government. And therefore, these powers to kill you without due process, take your property and so forth, they're not listed, they're not enumerated, so you don't need to worry. All right, so that made sense to people. They accepted the deal, but they wanted to be sure. Just as a precaution, they said, we want a Bill of Rights, which really should have been called a Bill of Prohibitions, because the Bill of Rights doesn't give rights at all. It recognized what you were saying earlier and what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration, that people are already endowed with rights. They don't get their rights from government. The rights pre-exist government. So the First Amendment prohibits Congress and implicitly the federal government and the president from depriving people of these pre-existing rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so forth. Now, to me, Richard, the big shift and the big problem we face in this country is twofold. One is that people never really understood, especially as the 20th century started taking place, the importance of economic liberty. I mean, it's as critical as freedom of speech, the right to keep everything you earn. Now, our ancestors understood that. That's why there was no income tax, there were very few regulations, no immigration controls. There were trade restrictions, tariffs, and so forth. But by and large, they understood the concept of you decide what to do with your own money. So there was no mandatory charity, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no education grants, and no foreign aid, and so forth. But as the 20th century goes on, people continue recognizing the importance of things like freedom of religion and freedom of the press, even though there were periodic assaults on these principles. Economic liberty effectively went out the window. So I think that's one thing that we need to revitalize in this country, is the idea that people have a right to keep everything they earn. They have a right to engage in economic enterprise without government interference. They have a right to have an occupation or a profession without a license or permit. That government has no role managing or controlling economic activity. And then the other big shift took place after World War II. America was founded as a constitutionally limited government republic. That means a limited government with very limited powers. With the conversion to a national security state, that went out the window. The military and the CIA and the NSA have effective totalitarian powers. They have a power to assassinate the American people, to torture them, put them in military dungeons. All they got to do is call them a terrorist. The federal courts have sustained these powers. I mean, there is no way, even in a democratic system, that you can say that Americans are free when a government has these totalitarian powers of secret surveillance, mass surveillance, torture, assassination, not just on foreigners, but on Americans as well. So I think those are the two big challenges that we face. Even in a democratic system, how do we raise people's vision to the idea that economic liberty is just as critically important as intellectual liberty, political liberty, religious liberty, and how do we get the restoration of a limited government republic and the dismantling of this totalitarian structure known as a national security state?
Yeah, I think one of the great successes on those on the political left, whether they be what we call American liberals, and certainly as you go further in that traditional notion of the political spectrum, the progressives, and then people like these democratic socialists, a great success, propaganda success, that has been going on for a century now, if not more, is the idea that freedom can be compartmentalized. There are personal freedoms, there are civil liberties, and then there's economic freedom. And they have been extremely successful in making the case that we can abridge, eat away at, even in principle abolish economic freedom without any threat or societal damage to personal freedom and civil liberties. Now, by personal freedom is, if you want to smoke marijuana, you smoke marijuana. If you want to have sex with another consensual adult of either gender and in any position you want to experiment with, that's your freedom. The government can't interfere with that. And civil liberties. The idea that, you can say what you want, you can write what you want, you can associate with people the way you want, and all of that can be preserved, which people notice as freedom most directly in their everyday life at one level. And we don't need economic freedom, because economic freedom involves some people owning the means of production, land, labor, and capital, and using it in ways to benefit themselves at the expense of others. The Marxian critique of capitalism. The workers work, the businessman owns, the workers have to work for the businessman extracts a part of what the workers produce as his ill-gotten gains, his exploited profits to live off the fruits of the labors of others. And surely, if we could just take that exploitation and tyranny away by the people owning, the people producing, or at a minimum, the people through their representatives regulating and siphoning off part of the ill-gotten gains for redistribution so there's a greater equality of fairness of income and wealth. We can do all that, and it in no way threatens civil liberties or personal freedoms. Their success in winning that argument is profoundly important. And that's why your point about economic freedom is so crucial, Jacob. We must restore an appreciation and an understanding, by logic and historical example, if you will, that to take away economic liberty, the ability to work for yourself, to freely contract and negotiate with others, to determine autonomously what is to be produced and how it's to be produced and where it's to be produced and at what price it may be sold through the voluntary and mutually agreed upon transactions of the consumers and demanders in the society. Without those liberties, civil liberties and personal freedoms are gone. What guarantee is there of civil liberties, freedom of speech and freedom of the press, if the government heavily regulates or owns all the printing presses, and therefore how many runs of a newspaper and what gets printed in the newspapers influenced or controlled by the political authority? What freedom of association is there when the government has the capacity to control when people can meet and in what the structures and circumstances can be that they can meet to share common interests, thoughts, or even grievances against the government? What personal freedoms are there when the government can regulate and restrict what is produced and what qualities and characteristics they have, which are essential to reflect who you are and what makes you a free individual? Many important classical liberals, particularly let's take the Nobel Prize winner Friedrich Hayek, hammered away, and Ludwig von Mises, who you mentioned earlier, and of course others such as Milton Friedman, all hammered away that at the end of the day, if there is no economic freedom, then there is no liberty at all anywhere. It doesn't mean that the government regulates or redistributes or takes over and runs one industry in the economy that freedom is dead. It doesn't work that way. But more and more as the government does it, it encroaches, it restricts, it confines, it controls. So that the more the government grows in its power, control, and influence or domination of economic decision-making, the more slowly but surely what is nibbled away at are the civil liberties and the personal freedoms, which are unsustainable and ultimately cannot exist without the freedom of the market based upon the right of the individual to produce and interact and trade with his neighbors, guided by their own decisions.
Yeah, I think a way to look at this is that just as we have a First Amendment prohibition on government regulating religion, say no law shall be passed respecting the establishment of religion, you could also have a constitutional amendment that says no law shall be enacted respecting the regulation of commerce or abridging the free exercise thereof. Then immediately, that means government can not involve itself in any economic activity, just like it can involve itself in religious activity today.
Yes.
And then you could have an amendment that says no law shall be enacted respecting the payment of welfare or any other special benefit to any person or entity. And all of a sudden you've wiped out every single welfare state program. But so what we need to be doing in this country is not just trying to figure out ways to reform this system, but do what our ancestors did. They were thinking at a higher level. They didn't think in terms of how to make a public churching system work more efficiently, maybe have vouchers in the public churching system. They said, no, let's think at a higher level where government doesn't involve itself at all. Now, there's also the problem of, as you know, Richard, that a piece of paper can't guarantee rights. And our critics often say this, well, how good did the Constitution do in protecting a free society and ensuring a free society was in existence? Well, actually, it did very well. I mean, if you eliminate slavery, which we all concede is a very horrific violation of liberty, and other things like women not having the right to vote, throughout the 19th century, you had trial by jury in criminal cases. You had right to counsel. You had, in terms of federal criminal prosecutions, you had freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Now, there were periodic assaults, but the basic principle was always there and enshrined. Open immigration, no gun control, no drug laws. That's no income tax for over 100 years. That's a system that has worked very effectively. When a system lasts 100 years, that's pretty effective. Now, obviously, a constitution is not sufficient to guarantee these things. You have to have that spirit of liberty within the hearts and minds of the people. There has to be a consensus that supports that philosophical bedrock of liberty in the Constitution. But a Constitution, Richard, the way I look at it, is like a seawall. It protects against high tides of public opinion. So it'll work for a long time to protect, a high tide of adverse public opinion against liberty. But it was never designed to protect against a tsunami. And so you can't blame the seawall for protecting against the tsunami, because that's not what the seawall was designed to do. And it's the same thing with the Constitution. You had a seawall, a tsunami in the 20th century in favor of socialism, not just all here in the United States, all over the world. And then you had this tsunami in favor of a national security state, this totalitarian type apparatus. So you can't really blame that, because the consensus among the people had changed. To them, liberty now meant welfare statism. It was the new idea that was gripping the world. Well, it wasn't really a new idea at all. It was the same old bankrupt idea of government control over economic activity. And then this national security statism, the same thing. So what we need to do is keep developing this new consensus in the American people of thinking at a higher level of enshrining economic liberty alongside with freedom of religion, and restoring our limited government republic by dismantling the national security state.
Yeah, the thing is, I want to sort of highlight this last few comments of yours, if I may. And I think it's important, the heritage and the culture of liberty. We classical liberals or libertarians often poo-poo our conservative cousins in or out of the Republican Party. When they show a reluctance, a resistance, an unwillingness to challenge at the political level, that is the electoral level, the Social Security system, Medicare and Medicaid, unemployment insurance, public housing, food stamps, in terms of abolishing these.
Public schooling.
And public schooling. Now we can point to a particular conservative or Republican who chooses not to have courage, integrity, a willingness to speak uncomfortable truth to the potential electorate that he is addressing himself to. But we have to ask the question, why is that that reluctance on the part of the conservative or the Republican, who in private conversation with you will often say, well, I'm not willing to go as far as you on a lot of, these libertarian issues, but, I'm with you 80 or 90% of the way. Why is he unwilling to express that 85 or 90% in the public discourse, in the political campaign arena? And it's what you just pointed out. It's against the tide. It means not being elected. Now, he may be a coward because he wants to be elected rather than run the risk of not being elected. That's the personal psychological flaw in that individual. But what he chooses to challenge and what he chooses not to is, in a sense, a reflection of the consensus of the people of the United States. The fact is, the vast majority of our fellow Americans do not want the abolition of the Social Security system. They do not want the end of Medicare and Medicaid. They don't want the end of public schools or food stamps or government subsidized housing or subsidized programs for the farmers or protections for various businessmen against foreign competition or. They have come to both depend upon, they all suckle at the tit of the state or drink at the trough of government privilege and favor in their little specialized groups that get nurtured through democratic give and takes of the actual real world of politics. And they cannot any longer imagine a world in which the government would not be involved and have responsibilities for these things. You challenge it, and they said, well, what will happen to the old people? What will happen to people who are sick or dying, whose own financial means are expiring? Do we leave them to die in the street? Who will care for them? Do you want the young to be illiterate? Don't you have to at least be able to read and write to be an informed person, to go about your daily life to earn a living, as well as an informed citizen? Surely, how can we have an informed citizen or even a person to go out and get a job if they can't be minimally literate? Who's going to do this? people cannot imagine anymore the institutional functioning as well as rightness of a truly free market and free society. So while we can castigate the conservative, the Republican, who may privately agree with us but does not have the courage to say those things publicly, his lack of courage is ultimately a reflection of the spirit of the times, the climate of opinion. That spirit of times and the climate of opinion has turned against economic liberty and therefore a lot of personal freedom. And that's what we have to restore and work to recover. It's not an easy job. It doesn't happen overnight, but you have to believe it's right and plod along so that maybe not in the next election cycle, but thinking of years and decades ahead, the climate of opinion can be changed sufficiently that the ship of state, the country, is moving in a free direction rather than continuing down the road of collectivism.
Yeah, I agree with you about these people being chameleons, but that's actually a hopeful sign as far as I'm concerned. Because if we can succeed in shifting this public opinion, the chameleons will quickly shift. In other words, they're not ideologues, most of them, especially people in public office. As the political winds shift, their positions shift. You see this especially with respect to legalization of marijuana now, where presidential candidates on the Democratic side are calling for legalization. It's not because they really believe in it. They can see the winds are shifting. So if we continue to do our work and we bring about this shift, then things could happen very rapidly. And I think, okay, you have a point, it might take decades, but I think it could happen very suddenly. Things could shift at once. When, remember, when we were working 30 years ago, I mean, we would talk about the long term. People were working for these ideas 50 years ago talking about the long term. We're now in their long term. There's absolutely no reason why that possibility doesn't exist, that the possibility that there could be a monumental shift toward liberty. And that's why we have to continue fighting for these ideals, regardless of what public opinion is. One, because it's right, but two, that's the only thing that's going to bring the shift, is causing people to think at this higher level. And the more of us that are causing people to think at this higher level, the greater the chance we're going to achieve our goal.
Yeah, I'm sure that there might be some viewers or listeners who are sharing their time with us today, Jacob, who say, oh yeah, that's all very well and good, but it's a lost cause. Nobody's hearing the message. Well, I'm old enough. Of course, we're both old enough, but I'll take the hit here. I'm old enough, Jacob, to remember that when I got interested in these ideas as in my teens, 15, 16 years old, yes, I was a nerd. I wanted to read about this stuff rather than go out partying. As I often say, you know that you're a nerd when you're in high school and already the girls call you the professor. I was a lonely guy on Friday and Saturday night. Oh, that was a killer. The professor at 17. Anyway, but I won't get into my tragedies of my youth. Anyway, but the point is, when I got interested in these ideas, Jacob, 15, 16 years old, there was hardly any of it. There was National Review, there was Human Events, of course there was Fee's publication, The Freeman, but that was basically it. No organizations, no outreach. I often like to say that the person who is interested in liberty could easily read the 6 books a year and the few magazines that were coming out monthly or bi-monthly that were being published, and keep up with all of the literature on the right, that is conservative and the then existing libertarian literature, to be truly a Renaissance man of the freedom of that time, because there was hardly any of it. Today, and to a great extent this has been due to the internet, but not alone. Today, if you think, and I'm not talking about absolute purity, but a sentiment of a belief in the freedom ideas, all the different types of think tanks devoted to either the general or specific concerns of economic liberty, environmental pro-free market groups, et cetera, et cetera. The amount of print and digital publications, the interactions that people have through blog, social media like Facebook about these issues. There is no way today that if a person believes in liberty, that even if he stays up 24 hours a day and takes 3 speed reading courses and masters them all, that he can successfully keep up with all of the literature, arguments, policy analyses that are now being put out by, in the broad brushstroke sense, organizations who care about personal freedom and in their own ways are concerned about the loss of economic liberty. In that sense, there is an intellectual sea change compared to when I was young, and I'll even admit the fact back in the 1960s. Now, it is true that the other set of ideas have grown as well, with degree of popularization and even epitomizing this, someone like Bernie Sanders, and the drift of the 2 political parties. But we must realize that we are not alone, that there is an underground of people who are interested in ideas, and who we can build upon in both refining and, as you were saying, purifying the principled case. And hopefully, with that in mind, bring about a transformation in the wider public opinion of the society. There is no reason for being depressed or forlorn. Will we win? Nobody can read the tea leaves of the future. But there are reasons for believing that there's possibilities. The power of ideas, the failure of those on the opposite side of the spectrum from us, the failures of socialism and interventionism, the bankruptcy of the welfare state, and the successes, however imperfectly in the real world, of more market-oriented policies, and the power of the case for leaving the individual to be a sovereign person, managing and controlling his ideas in free association with his neighbors. Those are powerful arguments and a rich historical experience of both our successes and their failures to build upon.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you see it in the think tank educational arena, as you say. There's libertarianism is everywhere. I mean, libertarianism is now on the table as compared to 30 years ago when we were first starting FFF. And then you saw the Ron Paul phenomenon. When Ron Paul ran for president in 2008 and 2012, I was stunned at the number of people that were rising up to support him. Millions of people. I mean, where'd they come from? And they all knew he was a Republican in name, but they all knew he was a libertarian by philosophy, and they were supporting him. Those people haven't gone away. I mean, some of them passed on, but it's a huge movement, and it's an exciting movement, and you never know what tomorrow can bring. But what's important is that we continue painting that case, that mosaic of what freedom really means. Because I think once people realize they're not free, that's half the battle. The big problem we have today is most Americans think they're free. And then once they come to that realization, then they can say, oh, well, do I want to continue living an unfree life under this welfare, warfare state way of life? Or do I want to join these libertarians and strive for a free society?
And I would just add that last point now, because I know you'll say it too, is that if you are made aroused to care about these ideas, a belief in freedom, there is no better place to go to on a regular, dare I say, daily basis than the website of the Future Freedom Foundation. Jacob there does daily blogging, regular articles, a stable of writers, of which I am very proudly able to say I am one, that attempt to analyze the problems of the days, economic, political, foreign policy, social, from as best as we can muster them, a consistent and principled case for personal freedom, free markets, and limited constitutional government, rightly and fully understood. There is no better place to learn that message from that website of the Future Freedom Foundation that was founded by and is guided by the fine spirit of Jacob Hornberger.
Well, Richard, I appreciate that. Especially since you and I started this organization some 28 years ago. Richard was the vice president of academic affairs and was all the way up, 15 years or so until he became president of FEE. And now we're working together to raise people's vision to a higher level. And we've always taken that position that if you stand for what's right, it doesn't matter what the results are. There's consolation in standing for what's right. But by standing for what's right, it produces the potential, the possibility of very good, positive outcomes.
Right.
On that level, thank you, Richard. Enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all for viewing, and thank you for your great support of FFF. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week, and I look forward to talking to our viewers again next week.
Till next time, thank you for joining us.